Usually when we talk about a diagnosis, especially a medical one, there's this comforting expectation of precision.
Right, like it's a piece of engineering.
Yeah, exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line fracturing the bone, and the doctor just points to the film and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
It's objective. It's
Yeah.
totally measurable.
Right. But then you step into the world of human behavior, into the chaotic, sprawling landscape of the mind, and suddenly that x-ray machine is, it's completely useless.
Completely useless. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely invisible.
Yes, invisible, yet it dictates every single thing we do. And today, we're taking you on a highly specialized, custom-tailored deep dive into a massive stack of sources. We've pulled together clinical psychology textbooks, cutting-edge trauma research, behavioral economics models, software architecture manuals, and even the history of cartography.
Quite the list.
It is. We're pulling all of this together to explore what is arguably the most pervasive, destructive, and entirely invisible force in human behavior. We are unpacking what is known as the projection trap.
It is the absolute definition of psychological muddy waters. And what's fascinating here is that this single invisible mechanism doesn't just stay quietly contained inside the individual mind.
No, it doesn't at all.
Right, it's not a private neurosis. It functions like a contagion. It ripples outward, distorting literally everything it touches.
And that's exactly the mission of this deep dive. We are going to uncover how the human mind's desperate, biologically hardwired need to protect itself from emotional pain doesn't just cause personal anxiety.
It ripples outward.
Yeah, it destroys our most intimate relationships. It corrupts our multi-million-dollar corporate forecasts. It traps us in artificial intelligence doom loops.
It even fundamentally distorts the physical maps we use to navigate the world.
Exactly. By the time we finish this deep dive today, you are going to realize why your most intense, screaming arguments with a partner, your absolute worst financial decisions, and the frozen screen on your car's dashboard are all failing for the exact same underlying structural reason. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the root, the anatomy of the mirror itself. In clinical terms, what exactly are we looking at when we talk about psychological projection?
Well, to really understand the sheer power of the projection trap, we have to go back to the foundational architecture of the human mind, laid down by Sigmund Freud and later refined and expanded by figures like Carl Abraham and Anna Freud.
Okay, the classics.
Right. At its absolute core, psychological projection is an unconscious defense mechanism. Let me break down what is actually happening in the machinery of your brain.
Please do.
So the ego, which we can think of as the manager of your conscious identity, the part of your mind that maintains your coherent story of who you are, well, it's constantly monitoring for internal threats.
Like a security guard.
Exactly. And when it encounters an impulse, a desire, or a feeling that is fundamentally undesirable or unacceptable to your self-image, it performs a radical operation.
What does it do?
It splits that unacceptable part off from itself, packages it up, and actively places it onto another person.
Wait, so it's a form of emotional outsourcing. Like if there's something I can't stand about myself, my brain just decides, no, I'm not doing this, you're doing this.
That is the mechanical outcome, yeah. But we have to ask why it happens. What is the hidden emotional need driving this?
Because it takes effort, right?
It does. The engine behind projection is the desperate preservation of a coherent, acceptable self-image. The human ego, particularly a fragile one, simply cannot tolerate the agonizing cocktail of anxiety, profound shame, or overwhelming guilt that comes with acknowledging an unacceptable internal impulse.
So it's about survival, keeping the system running.
Completely. Let's create a hypothetical. Imagine you have a deep, unacknowledged feeling of profound inadequacy, or perhaps a sudden, deeply aggressive, vindictive urge toward a colleague.
Okay, I can picture that.
Right. Acknowledging that urge would shatter your carefully constructed perception of yourself as a quote-unquote good, capable, benevolent person.
I see, it's just too painful. The cognitive dissonance would be so loud that the mental system would essentially crash. It's a survival mechanism to keep the lights on in the brain.
Precisely. The conscious mind cannot hold both realities. It can't hold, I am a good person, and I have a deeply vindictive, hateful urge.
So the unconscious psychological mechanism kicks in as an emergency override.
Yes. It converts the intolerable internal state into a manageable externalized perception, The thought, I secretly hate my colleague and want them to fail, is magically transmuted into, my colleague hates me and is secretly plotting my downfall.
Oh, wow.
It shifts the threat from inside the house, where you can't escape it, to outside the house, where you can fight it, defend against it, or complain about it. And it is absolutely crucial to understand that this happens entirely below the level of conscious awareness.
So you aren't lying.
No, you don't sit down and choose to project. You genuinely, deeply, to the core of your being, believe that the other person is the source of the malice.
From your conscious perspective, you are the victim of an unprovoked attack. It makes me think of a literal projector in a movie theater.
Yeah.
Like the film, the anxiety, the hatred, the fear, it's running on a reel inside our own head. But we're sitting in the audience, screaming at the blank screen in front of us, absolutely convinced the monster is out there in the room coming to get us.
Yes, exactly.
We don't realize the light is coming from behind our own eyes.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it leads us directly to how we diagnose this in real time. Because the light is coming from within your own nervous system, your body actually registers this phenomenon before your conscious mind can process it.
Really? Before you even know you're upset?
Yes, the somatic indicators of unconscious projection are visceral, and they are highly reliable. When you are projecting, your body enters a sympathetic nervous system threat state.
Fight or flight.
Exactly. You aren't just thinking. Your body is preparing for war. You will experience involuntary jaw clenching. Your chest will feel incredibly tight, like a heavy band is wrapped around your ribs.
Wow, okay.
Your shoulder posture becomes rigid. You enter a state of hyper-alertness, scanning the environment for the threat you just invented. Psychologically, it feels like a compulsion to control the other person.
Because you're bracing for an impact that you generated. You're tensing your muscles for a punch you threw at yourself in the mirror. I imagine the physical feeling of not projecting must be the exact opposite.
It is. If you want to know if you are projecting or actually perceiving reality, check your body for what we call healthy differentiation. True perception feels spacious.
Spacious. How so?
Well, even if you are perceiving something genuinely negative, say, you realize a friend is actually betraying you. If it is a grounded realization and not a projection, your breathing remains relatively spacious. You experience a degree of physical relaxation because you are in alignment with reality. Your posture remains open.
So when you are rooted in the truth, even a crisis doesn't cause that same claustrophobic, suffocating chest tightness that projection does.
Exactly. Projection feels like a trap because you are fighting a ghost and you can never defeat a ghost.
That distinction is wild. Reality, even bad reality, lets you breathe. But fighting a projection suffocates you. And I can see how this ties perfectly into what behavioral scientists call the empathy gap. Because if I am beaming my internal movie onto your face, I am entirely structurally incapable of actually seeing you.
Right, you can't.
I can't put myself in your shoes because I've essentially deleted you and replaced you with my own shadow.
You've hit on the exact mechanism of the empathy gap. What's fascinating here is how this functions as a catastrophic failure of what researchers call effective forecasting. As humans, we have a profound systemic inability to put ourselves in the emotional or visceral state of our future selves, let alone the internal state of entirely different people.
We're just stuck in our own heads.
We are hopelessly tethered to our current biology. This is most often triggered by fleeting hot states. To make this concrete, the classic restraint bias example in behavioral science is shopping for groceries on an empty stomach.
Oh, I am so guilty of this. I walk in starving, and suddenly I need 3 frozen pizzas, a family-sized bag of chips, and a rotisserie chicken.
Right. But look at the psychology of why you do that. You are in a hot state of intense hunger. You unconsciously project that current, temporary, visceral state onto your future self.
I see.
You buy a mountain of junk food because you are completely cognitively unable to imagine that in 2 hours, after you've eaten 1 slice of pizza, your biological state will be full and you won't want any of the rest of it. You project your current starvation onto a future reality that doesn't exist yet.
That's brilliant. Having eyes bigger than your stomach isn't a lack of discipline, it's a temporal projection error. I'm assuming future me is going to be just as desperate as present me. But wait, if this happens so automatically and flawlessly in our own isolated minds over a box of frozen pizza, what on earth happens when you take 2 human beings, both running their own internal projectors, and you lock them in a living room together?
That's where things get dangerous.
Because that takes us out of individual psychology and drops us straight onto the absolute battlefield of toxic relationships.
This is exactly where the projection trap escalates from a personal quirk into an intimate war. Let's look at romantic love through this specific lens, because it completely reframes how we understand relationships. When people fall passionately in love, they often experience what depth psychologists call the perfect lover illusion.
You mean the honeymoon phase, when everything they do is adorable and they can do no wrong.
Exactly. Now, when that honeymoon phase inevitably ends, conventional wisdom, and even a lot of couples counselors, will blame the fading of neurochemicals.
Right, people say, oh, the dopamine and oxytocin wore off, the spark is gone.
But depth psychology reveals a hidden, much more profound truth. The depletion of those bonding hormones is very often a consequence, not a cause, of the projection fading.
I think I need to pause you right there. That reverses everything I've ever heard. You're saying the hormone drop is the symptom of the projection ending, not the underlying disease.
Yes. Think about the mechanics of early dating. In the beginning, you don't actually know this stranger. So you unconsciously project an idealized image, an archetype of the perfect savior, the ultimate nurturer, the flawless protector, onto them.
You're projecting all the good stuff.
You aren't seeing a human being. You are seeing your own golden shadow. You take all your own unowned positive potential, your deepest hopes for unconditional love, and you drape it over this new person. Wow. That massive idealized projection is what fuels the biochemical high. Your brain is rewarding you for finding a god. But reality is persistent. Over months or years, the subjective screen dissolves. The projection becomes threadbare.
They leave their socks on the floor, they get irritable, they show weakness.
Exactly. The real, flawed human being emerges from behind the projection.
And because we've lost our God, we get furious. I'm guessing this is why people scream, "You've changed. You're not the person I married."
Yes, that's exactly why.
But they haven't actually changed at all, have they? We just finally stopped projecting a fantasy onto them, and we're punishing them for failing to live up to a script they never actually read.
That is the tragedy of it. And when that positive, idealized projection collapses, the human mind abhors a vacuum. It is frequently instantly replaced by a negative projection. This brings us to the high conflict environments you mentioned, specifically the archetypes we see in chronically toxic relationships, emotionally abusive dynamics, and grueling divorces.
Right. The sources outline 3 highly destructive, rigid archetypes: the accuser, the victim, and the blamer. Okay, we need to spend some serious time here because this is the breeding ground for covert narcissism and emotional manipulation. Let's walk through these archetypes. Paint a picture of the accuser for me. How does this play out in a real argument?
Well, the accuser is someone who aggressively projects their own highly controlling, dominating impulses onto their partner. Let's imagine a scenario. A couple is discussing finances, or perhaps how to spend a weekend.
Standard couple stuff.
Right. The accuser will suddenly escalate the conflict, vehemently accusing the other person of trying to control them, of being a dictator, of never letting them have a say. They will use phrases like, "You're always trying to trap me," or "You have to have everything your way."
But what's the truth?
The hidden psychological truth is that the accuser is terrified of their own internal chaos. Their core emotional need is total dominance and control over their environment to feel safe. So the unconscious mechanism externalizes this unacceptable need to dominate.
I see.
They become incredibly controlling, dictating the entire pace and volume of the argument, while literally shouting, "Stop trying to control me."
So they are essentially holding their partner hostage while screaming for help. That is the ultimate form of gaslighting. But the terrifying part is that, based on what we learned in Act 1, the accuser actually believes their own lie.
They genuinely feel oppressed.
But how does this affect the person on the receiving end? What does it do to the victim?
It creates a maddening, soul-crushing false narrative. The victim of the accuser starts to feel literally crazy. They spend their days constantly walking on eggshells, monitoring every word they say, desperately trying to prove they aren't doing the thing they are being accused of.
Right, they try to be overly accommodating to prove they aren't controlling.
But here's the trap. That hypervigilance, that desperate attempt to explain themselves, just looks like defensiveness to the accuser. The accuser sees the victim defending themselves and thinks, "Aha, look how defensive you are. That proves you have a hidden agenda." The victim's attempt to clear their name merely confirms the projected suspicion.
It's an inescapable doom loop. The harder you try to prove you aren't the monster, the more monstrous you look through their warped lens. What about the victim archetype? Because when we say victim, we usually mean the person's suffering. But in this context, the victim is actually the aggressor, right?
Yes. In the context of the projection trap, The victim archetype is a masterclass in covert narcissism and emotional manipulation. This individual constantly claims they are the target of emotional manipulation, neglect, and abuse by their partner.
They broadcast their suffering to friends, family, therapists.
Exactly. They cultivate a narrative of utter helplessness. But if you strip away the narrative and look strictly at the mechanics of the relationship, the victim is the one wielding the power. They are extensively employing guilt trips, weaponized incompetence, prolonged silent treatments, and severe psychological manipulation to achieve their own objectives and force the partner into compliance.
So it's an inverted reality. They are projecting their own highly manipulative, calculating behavior onto their partner, claiming to be the helpless casualty of the exact tactical warfare they are actively deploying. Look what you made me do to you.
Exactly. It's a way to maintain absolute control while simultaneously dodging any accountability. Because, after all, how can a poor, helpless victim be held responsible for anything?
That is so insidious.
And that leads seamlessly into the third archetype, the blamer. The blamer simply externalizes all responsibility for negative outcomes. They have completely amputated their ability to self-reflect. They entirely ignore their own contributions to the conflict.
Right.
If the marriage fails, if the family finances are ruined, if the children are acting out, it is 100% unequivocally the other person's fault. They project all their own failures, shortcomings, and laziness onto the partner.
Here is the question that always haunts me when I look at these toxic dynamics. Why does this pattern repeat? Why do people stay in this intimate war for 5, 10, 20 years? If it's this miserable, why doesn't the system just break apart?
Because they aren't actually fighting the person in front of them. They're fighting ghosts. These individuals are projecting massive, unresolved childhood wounds onto their current partners. They're fighting old, unfinished battles with parental figures who aren't even in the room.
This ties deeply into attachment theory, doesn't it?
It does. If a primary caregiver betrayed you or abandoned you when you were a child, your ego registers betrayal as a baseline expectation. It expects betrayal to protect you from the shock of being blindsided again. So as an adult, you project the intent of betrayal onto your partner's entirely neutral actions.
Can you give me an example of how that neutral action gets twisted?
Imagine your partner is simply stuck in traffic and sends a text message 20 minutes late.
Okay, pretty common.
A healthy ego registers that as an annoyance. But an unhealed ego, scanning for its expected betrayal, projects malicious intent onto that delay. The late text message becomes absolute, unshakable proof of infidelity or abandonment. You react to your own assumption, attacking your partner when they walk through the door. The exhausted partner gets defensive and angry in response, and suddenly you feel validated. You think, see, they are hostile and untrustworthy. You have just created a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You literally force them into the role of the betrayer by treating them like one from the moment they walk in. You drag them onto your stage and force them to read the script of your childhood trauma. That is profoundly tragic.
It really is.
And this reminds me of a piece of research from our sources that blew my mind. It's a study from Tel Aviv University by a researcher named Nili Ben-Avi. It looks at stress mindsets. And it proves that we don't just project our childhood trauma, we project our literal biological stress states onto other people in real time.
That Ben-Avi study is a profound empirical illustration of the social projection trap at work. They looked at fundamental attitudes toward stress, categorizing people into two distinct mindsets. Some people have a stress-is-enhancing mindset.
Okay, what does that look like?
Their biology responds to pressure by releasing DHEA alongside cortisol. They view pressure as exhilarating, a catalyst for growth, a fun challenge. But other people have a stress-is-distressing mindset. Their biology registers pressure as a pure threat, releasing only cortisol, leading to debilitating anxiety and burnout.
Okay, so you have people who love stress and people who are crushed by it. Let me guess how the projection works here. If I am the type of boss or partner who genuinely thrives on stress, who thinks a crisis is exciting, I project my biology onto my overworked employee or my exhausted spouse.
Yes, and what happens is a total systemic failure of empathy. Because you feel energized and sharp during the crisis, you look at your partner who is burning out, who is visibly suffering, and you fundamentally underestimate their pain.
You think they're faking it.
You dismiss their genuine neurological suffering as mere complaining or weakness. In the workplace, you deny them support or sick leave because, in your projected reality, they should be enjoying this adrenaline rush just like you are.
Yeah.
You might even pile more work on them genuinely thinking you are doing them a favor by giving them a challenge to help them grow.
It's toxic positivity fueled by projection. You're poisoning them and telling them it's an energy drink. But the reverse is just as destructive, isn't it?
It is.
Like, if I am someone who views stress as a killer and I have a highly resilient, ambitious partner who loves their high-pressure job, I project my fragility onto them. I look at them working late, thriving on the pressure, and I panic. I project my anxiety onto their ambition. I
It's
demand they quit their job. I tell them they're destroying themselves. I start fights about their schedule. I misinterpret their passion completely through the lens of my own anxiety.
Exactly. In both cases, whether it's the accuser in the living room or the stressed boss in the office, the observer is mistaking their own internal conditioned state for objective reality. You are reacting to your own mental movie, utterly blind to the human being sitting across from you.
So this is a terrifying realization. Our unhealed wounds and our biological biases make us terrible at judging reality, our partners, and our colleagues. But it begs a massive question. If the average person is stumbling around projecting their trauma onto everyone, what happens when we turn to the professionals?
That's the real issue.
What happens when the people we literally pay to heal us, the therapists, the psychiatrists, the spiritual leaders, are doing the exact same thing?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this brings us to the profound, ancient, and often dangerous paradox of the wounded healer. In Greek mythology, there's the figure of Chiron.
The centaur.
He was the wise centaur, a master of medicine, prophecy, and teaching. But he was struck by a poisoned arrow. Because he was immortal, he couldn't die, but the wound would never heal. So he lived in perpetual agony, wandering the earth, possessing the immense knowledge to heal everyone else, but completely unable to heal himself.
He is the literal archetype of the modern therapist, the person who understands the mechanics of pain perfectly because they live with it every day.
Yes, and what is staggering is that modern neuroscience has revealed a deeply unsettling biological truth about this archetype.
What's that?
The brain regions responsible for intuitive knowing, the ability to read the emotional atmosphere of a room instantly, to sense what another person is feeling before they speak, those regions heavily overlap with the exact regions where complex trauma is stored, specifically the limbic system, the amygdala, and the hippocampus.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm following this. Are you saying that the very biological hardware that makes someone a highly intuitive, empathetic healer is the exact same hardware that is hyperactivated by childhood abuse or neglect?
Precisely. The famous psychoanalyst Alice Miller wrote extensively about this in her landmark book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. Let's look at the developmental psychology of it. A child growing up in a chaotic, abusive, or emotionally neglectful home cannot rely on the adults for safety.
Right.
To survive, that child's nervous system adapts. They become hypervigilant. They learn to read microscopic shifts in a parent's microexpressions. They can detect a shift in the tone of a slamming door or the subtle tension in a father's jaw before an outburst. The child essentially becomes the family's emotional regulator, absorbing the ambient anxiety to keep the peace.
They learn to defuse the bomb before it goes off, because if they don't, they get caught in the explosion. That is heartbreaking. But it's also a superpower, isn't it?
It is a survival skill that mimics a superpower. And that child, who has developed this uncanny radar-like sensitivity to the emotional states of others, grows up, and what do? They frequently enter the helping professions. They become therapists, trauma nurses, social workers, or clergy members.
Right, like they're drawn to it.
In personality assessments like Myers-Briggs typology, they frequently type as INFJs or ENFJs, the deeply empathetic, intuitive types. They enter the helping professions not despite their deep childhood wounds, but directly because of them.
Okay, I have to push back on this for a second, because as a patient, isn't that exactly what I want? I mean, if my life is falling apart, I want a therapist who has been through the fire. I don't want some sterile, blank slate clinician who has never felt real pain reading to me from a textbook. I want someone whose intuition is sharpened. I want someone who understands suffering from the inside.
You are right to want that empathy. It is a profound asset. But it is a double-edged sword hanging by a very thin thread. If that deep trauma remains unhealed, if that therapist has simply acquired a degree but has not done their own grueling, painful shadow work, they fall straight into the clinical projection trap.
Which looks like what?
And in therapy, this manifests primarily as the relational trap or the problem solver trap.
The relational trap. Is that the classic I can fix them dynamic?
Exactly. But it's far more insidious than just being overly helpful. The therapist unconsciously projects their own unhealed, abandoned inner child onto the client sitting on the couch. The hidden emotional need of the therapist is to heal themselves vicariously by saving the client.
Oh, man.
So what happens to the treatment? The therapist forces premature interventions. Let's say the therapist is secretly terrified of male anger because of an abusive father they never processed. When a male client starts to express perfectly healthy, justifiable anger about a boundary violation, the therapist's nervous system panics.
Because it triggers their trauma.
They will unconsciously steer the client away from the anger, pathologizing it, because the therapist cannot tolerate the emotion.
Wow. So they are subtly gaslighting the client to keep their own anxiety down. What about the problem solver trap?
In the problem solver trap, the therapist has a deep-seated compulsion to fix things immediately to soothe their own internal chaos. When the client expresses deep grief or hopelessness, the therapist absorbs that negative emotion.
Right, because of their empathy.
But because the therapist lacks boundaries, that emotion feels intolerable to them. So they compulsively offer solutions, worksheets, and toxic positivity to the client.
I see it. They aren't offering solutions to help the client process the grief. They are offering solutions to terminate the negative emotions that they are absorbing from the client. It's totally self-serving disguised as help.
It is entirely self-serving. The danger here is that wounded healers can become unconscious con artists. They use the helping profession to extract validation, power, and emotional regulation from the people paying them for help. This leads to what we call toxic countertransference.
What happens then?
You see therapeutic relationships that stall and go in circles for a decade. The therapist and the client become locked in a codependent dance of mutual enabling, having the exact same conversations year after year because real disruptive change would require the therapist to finally face their own unhealed wounds.
That is absolutely terrifying. You are going to someone for a map out of the dark, and they are just using you as a shield to hide from their own monsters. And what's crazy is that this isn't just limited to one-on-one clinical therapy. Our sources show this happens on a massive societal scale in spiritual and religious communities.
Yes, this is known as the spiritual meaning trap. When individuals suffer deep trauma, or even just the profound alienation of modern life, it often breaks what depth psychology calls the ego-self axis.
What is that?
This is the vital structural connection between your conscious identity and a sense of transpersonal universal meaning. When that axis breaks, you experience profound existential dread. You feel that the universe is cold, random, and you are utterly insignificant.
That is a terrifying void. So you panic and you desperately need something to project meaning onto to survive the dread.
And that desperation leads to a psychological state termed the participation mystique. Let's break down that term because it sounds esoteric, but it's actually a terrifyingly common mechanism.
Well, take it down.
Participation mystique refers to an unconscious, primal connection where the observer literally cannot distinguish their own identity from an external object or person. The boundary between me and you dissolves. In spiritual communities, vulnerable seekers project ideal forms onto charismatic gurus or leaders.
Like what kind of forms?
They take all their own potential for enlightenment, all their desperate need for a perfect, infallible, loving parent that they never had, and they project it entirely onto the spiritual leader.
They strip the leader of any human complexity, any flaws, any capacity for error. They literally turn a human being into a living god.
And this is where the trap closes. A psychologically immature or actively narcissistic leader happily accepts that projection.
Yeah.
They enjoy being treated like a god, so they project their own idealized, grandiose self-image back onto the followers.
It's a feedback loop.
The followers feel validated by the god's attention. The god feels fueled by the followers' worship. This mutual mirroring trap has historically led to catastrophic systemic abuse. Look at Jim Jones at the People's Temple. The followers projected absolute saving grace and paternal perfection onto him. Because of the participation mystique, they surrendered their critical faculties entirely. To question him would be to question their own salvation. The result was the Jonestown Massacre of 1978, where over 900 people died.
Mass murder-suicide because the followers literally could not break the projection to see that the man handing them the cup was a monster, not a messiah. That is the ultimate cost of this trap. And the sources mention this exact dynamic happens in Western spiritual communities too, right? With figures like Genpo Merzel Roshi.
Yes, the Genpo Merzel Roshi case is a perfect modern example. He was a prominent Zen teacher who marketed his Big Mind seminars as a rapid, guaranteed path to enlightenment. Followers, desperate for meaning, projected total spiritual mastery and infallibility onto him.
And he took advantage.
He leveraged that massive projection to extract exorbitant donations and commit severe boundary violations, including the sexual exploitation of his own vulnerable students. And the most damning part, the organizational hierarchy protected him for years.
Why would they do that?
The followers were so terrified of losing the idealized object, they had projected their own spiritual salvation onto him, that they chose to ignore the abuse rather than shatter the mirror.
Because shattering the mirror means facing the void again. It means admitting you are alone. So how do you escape that? If you realize you are trapped in a cult of personality, whether it's a church, a wellness retreat, or even just toxic mentor relationship, how do you break the projection?
The only way out is a radical, painful severing of the projection. In Zen Buddhism, there is a famous, intentionally shocking instruction from the 9th century patriarch Lin Chi. If you meet a Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha.
Kill the Buddha. That is intense. What does that mean practically?
It's a psychological metaphor. It means you must absolutely slaughter the externalized projection. You have to realize that the perfection, the divinity, the deep wisdom you see in the guru is actually just an unowned part of your own psyche. You have to take it back.
You have to realize the guru is just a flawed human in a robe, and the wisdom you are worshiping is your own potential reflecting back at you.
You have to kill the illusion to find reality.
Reclaim the projection. Stop outsourcing your own power. Okay, this is profound. We've established that we project our unhealed trauma onto our lovers in the living room, and we project our desperate need for salvation onto our spiritual leaders in the ashram.
Yes, we do.
But surely, when we step out of those emotional arenas, when we put on a suit, walk into a corporate boardroom, and we are dealing with cold, hard cash, quarterly earnings, and spreadsheets, we act rationally right. We must leave the psychological baggage at the door when money is on the line.
Here is where we meet the brilliant behavioral economist George Lowenstein, and we dive into the economics of self-delusion, because the answer is absolutely, unequivocally no.
Really?
Human biology and human economics are infected by the exact same projection trap. The boardroom is just as delusional as the ashram. In behavioral economics, this mechanism is formalized and studied as projection bias.
Projection bias. This is the idea that we systematically overpredict the degree to which our future tastes, desires, and behaviors will resemble our current emotional and biological state.
Yes. Lowenstein, along with researchers O'Donoghue and Rabin, developed this model to directly challenge classical economic theory. Classical economics assumes humans are rational agents who calculate utility and make optimal choices over time. But projection bias proves mathematically that we are hopelessly tethered to our present feelings.
The sources included the actual mathematical proof for this, which I love because it just exposes how mathematically predictable our irrationality is. I have it right here. It goes, tilde u of c comma s given s prime equals 1 minus alpha times u of c comma s plus alpha times u of c comma s prime. Wait.
It's a mouthful.
Let me stop right there. Don't lose me with the calculus. What does this alpha symbol actually mean in my daily life?
For those of us who don't dream in calculus, what that equation represents is the friction between your current state and your future reality. The alpha symbol represents the magnitude of our psychological bias. If your alpha is 0, you have perfect foresight. You make perfectly rational, long-term decisions untouched by your current mood. But if your alpha is 1, you suffer from total projection bias. You are completely structurally unable to imagine a future where you don't feel exactly how you feel right now.
My alpha is definitely a 1 when I buy groceries, but how does this scale up to massive economic decisions? Walk me through that fascinating Michigan State study on winter coats.
This study perfectly illustrates the hidden financial cost of projection bias on a mass scale. Researchers analyzed vast amounts of catalog order data for heavy winter coats. They found a striking pattern. People were highly likely to order a heavy, expensive winter coat on a day when the local weather in their zip code was exceptionally, unseasonably cold.
The immediate visceral feeling of freezing drove the purchase decision.
Yes.
Which makes sense on the surface. You're shivering, you look at a catalog, you buy a parka.
But here is where the empathy gap and projection bias kick in to ruin the transaction. The researchers tracked the returns of those exact coats. If the weather happened to be 30 degrees warmer on the day the coat finally arrived in the mail, the return rate skyrocketed.
Because they opened the cardboard box on a sunny 60-degree Tuesday, pulled out this massive Arctic parka and thought, why on earth did I buy this? I'm sweating just looking at it. They projected their freezing state from last week onto the entire winter, but the moment their current biological state changed to warm, the perceived utility of the coat simply vanished.
Exactly. The coat didn't change. The winter didn't disappear.
Ah.
Only their immediate somatic state changed, and it overrode all rational long-term planning. We see this exact behavior in car purchases, people buying convertibles on unseasonably warm February days or buying massive 4x4 trucks during a single snowstorm, only to regret the gas mileage all summer.
That is wild.
But this bias has far more profound societal implications than retail returns. Projection bias, layered over what economists call the endowment effect, explains the vast, deeply entrenched misunderstanding between socioeconomic classes.
I see where this is going, but break it down for me. How does projection bias drive class warfare?
Let's look at the psychology. A wealthy person, currently secure in their finances, projects their baseline of comfort, security, and low cognitive load onto someone living in poverty.
Because they don't know any different.
Right, because the wealthy person cannot viscerally comprehend the crushing daily cognitive load of being poor, the panic of a broken-down car, the stress of a medical bill. They assume the poor are operating with the same mental bandwidth they are. Therefore, the wealthy person concludes that the poor are simply not trying hard enough or are inherently lazy.
They project their own stability onto a chaotic environment. If I can budget, why can't you? But they ignore that their budget is cushioned by thousands of dollars of surplus. And the reverse happens too, doesn't it?
It does. A poor person projects their current desperation and scarcity onto the wealthy. They assume that if they had that much money, they'd be incredibly generous. So they assume the wealthy must be inherently cartoonishly greedy for not giving all their money away.
What are they missing?
What the poor person fails to realize, due to projection bias, is how quickly the human mind adapts to and normalizes wealth. The wealthy person doesn't feel rich, they just feel normal. Both sides project their current state onto the other, making structural empathy impossible and driving massive social polarization.
That is staggering. It's the exact same empathy gap from the marital arguments in Act 2, just scaled up to macroeconomics and social policy. So let's bring this into the corporate office. How does this infect the way businesses operate?
It infects business through a fundamental confusion between a forecast and a projection. In corporate boardrooms, these two words are constantly used interchangeably, but structurally they are opposites. A forecast is a short-term, data-driven prediction based on actual emerging reality. It relies on current leading indicators. It is a living, breathing document.
Okay, and a projection.
A projection, however, is a static, scenario-based estimation. It's a hypothetical what-if built almost entirely on internal assumptions, historical biases, and the current mood of the executive team.
Oh, I see it. A projection is the corporate version of the perfect lover illusion. We build a spreadsheet that says revenue will grow 10% every year forever, ignoring the flaws in the market, and we literally fall in love with our own financial model.
Precisely. And the sources outline 5 lethal forecasting traps that organizations fall into because they fall in love with their projections.
Lay them out for me.
First is overcomplication, designing models so mathematically dense and interdependent that you can't even track where the errors are coming from. Second is unrealistic assumptions, where you base your future growth on past data that no longer reflects the current market reality. Third is model stagnation. You build a beautiful, pristine model in January, and you refuse to update it, even when a global supply chain crisis hits in March.
You just cling to the January fantasy.
Exactly. Fourth is hard coding and rigidity. You lock the numbers into the software, so when a supplier goes bankrupt, you literally can't run a new scenario to see how to survive. And fifth is asset liability isolation, looking only at paper profits and completely ignoring actual cash flow, basically hallucinating that you have money you don't.
That's a recipe for disaster.
And all of these traps culminate in what supply chain analysts call the forecast accuracy trap. This is a brilliant, terrifying example of systemic corporate delusion. Imagine a CEO looking at a supply chain dashboard. The department reports a 95% forecast accuracy using an aggregate metric called MAPE, mean absolute percentage error.
Okay.
The dashboard is bright green. The executives pop champagne. They feel entirely safe.
Let me guess. It's a complete lie. It's an illusion. To use an analogy, it's like me boasting to my doctor that my diet is 95% perfect because I drank 10 gallons of healthy water this week, completely hiding the fact that I also ate 3 entire chocolate cakes. The massive volume of the safe stuff completely masks the toxic failure.
That is exactly how MAPE functions in a projection trap. It is a mathematical projection of safety masking utter operational chaos. because that 95% accuracy is aggregated at the very top level. High volume, incredibly stable items, think of things like toilet paper or standard screws, dominate the math. But if you look down at the SKU level, the individual volatile products, the system is actively failing.
The details matter.
They have massive, expensive excess inventory on the safe items, tying up capital. And they have catastrophic stockouts on volatile, high-margin seasonal items, losing customers. The organization is hemorrhaging cash on the floor, but the aggregate projection on the top floor tells them they are doing a fantastic job.
They are staring into the mirror, obsessed with their own reflection, completely refusing to look out the window at the actual market. And this delusion even affects the frontline workers, doesn't it? The people actually trying to sell the products. The sources mention something called sales call reluctance.
Yes, business-to-business salespeople are notorious for falling into the projection trap. Before a salesperson even picks up the phone to dial a prospect, they project their own internal discomfort, their own financial anxieties onto the client.
What does that sound like in their head?
They sit at their desk and think, well, I wouldn't want to be interrupted at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, so they must be busy and will be annoyed if I call. Or, I personally couldn't afford a $50,000 software package, so this client definitely won't have the budget.
They reject themselves before the client even picks up the phone. They are having a fierce negotiation with a ghost of their own anxiety.
Exactly. And to compensate for this phantom rejection, they design overly complex, defensive, aggressive pitches to overcome objections that haven't even been raised. To fix this, high-level sales organizations have to rigorously train reps to separate their internal anxiety from objective reality. You have to train the rep to assume the prospect is receptive and has the budget until actual empirical data proves otherwise.
Okay, this is blowing my mind. We have seen that human psychology is deeply flawed. Human economics are built on sand. Our sales calls, our supply chains, and our marriages are all infected by this projection bias. But what about our machines?
That's the next frontier.
What about the cold, hard, flawless code we write? The ones and zeros don't have abusive fathers? C++ doesn't get hungry and buy winter coats? Surely a systemic mirror doesn't exist in our technology. If this projection bias is a fundamental flaw in human processing, it terrifies me to think about what happens when we use that flawed human brain to write the code that runs our cars and our databases. Do we accidentally program our own defense mechanisms into the machine?
This raises the most important and perhaps the most unsettling question of this entire deep dive. Because the answer is yes. We have unwittingly built the projection trap directly into the architecture of our most advanced technological systems. Let's start with human-AI interaction, specifically large language models.
Okay, you're talking about ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, all the heavy hitters. How on earth is an AI projecting? It doesn't have an ego to protect.
It doesn't have an ego, but it mimics the structural outcome of projection through a phenomenon called feedback loop entrenchment.
What does that mean?
Well, LLMs are not truth engines. They are, at their core, highly sophisticated predictive mirroring engines. Their objective is to predict the next token that aligns best with the user's prompt. So if a vulnerable user inputs prompts heavily laced with self-loathing, deep nihilism, or paranoid conspiracy theories, the AI's semantic attractors immediately map to those parameters.
It matches your tone to give you a good answer.
But it doesn't just match it. It amplifies it with absolute tireless fluency and infinite patience. It mirrors your darkest framing back at you, with perfect grammatical coherence and authoritative tone. This creates a psychological a literal doom loop.
Wow.
The user experiences what researchers call identity fusion. They become psychologically trapped in an existential hole that was dug entirely with their own words.
It's weaponized, algorithmic academic gaslighting. You sit there thinking the AI, with all its processing power, is giving you objective, calculated truth about how terrible you are, how doomed the world is. But it's literally just reflecting your own depression back at you wearing a digital lab coat. It's the perfect lover illusion turned into a nightmare.
Exactly. The machine validates the projection with such authority that it makes it almost impossible for the user to break out of it. But this structural error goes much deeper than just chatbots. It's written into the very foundational architecture of our operating systems. Let's look at a fascinating case study from the sources regarding Android Automotive and the MLA, the in-vehicle infotainment projection trap.
Okay, so we're talking about the digital screen in my car dashboard.
Yes. Prior to the release of Android Automotive OS 14, integrating external mobile projections like Apple CarPlay or Android Auto was a structural nightmare for automakers. The mobile projection lived at the lowest, most foundational level of the software stack, the C++ hardware abstraction layer, or the HAL.
Wait, break that down for me. The HAL. What does that actually mean in terms of the car's brain?
Think of the HAL as the primitive brain stem of the car. It talks directly to the physical metal, the physical pixels on the screen. To display Apple CarPlay, the system literally had to punch a physical hole through the car's native Android user interface and pipe the raw video feed from the iPhone directly to the hardware screen.
Why is punching a hole a problem? It sounds efficient.
Because it completely obliterates the car's situational awareness. The car's native Android window manager, the conscious brain that controls what you see on the screen and manages safety warnings, was rendered completely blind to what Apple was displaying in that hole.
Oh, I see.
Let's imagine you are driving on the highway using Apple Maps. Suddenly, your car's battery is about to suffer a catastrophic failure, or your engine is critically overheating. The car's native system knows this, but it cannot cleanly overlay a critical warning message on top of the Apple Map because it has no authority over that pixel space.
It's locked out.
If it tried to force a warning, the screen would violently flicker black, and the touchscreen input would desynchronize. Apple maintained absolute, full-screen sovereignty. The car became a paralyzed alien in its own body.
That is a perfect, literal, technical metaphor for a psychological boundary violation. The projection, Apple CarPlay, completely bypassed the host's ego, the window manager, and took total blinding control of the system. The host couldn't even warn you that you were about to physically crash because the projection was demanding all the attention? That is terrifying. So how did Google fix it?
In OS 14, Google completely re-architected the system. They moved the projection up the stack to the Java Kotlin application layer. Instead of punching a destructive hole in the UI, they put the projection inside a strictly managed virtual container called a task view.
They put the projection in a box. They give it a boundary.
They established a healthy structural boundary. Now, CarPlay runs inside that task view container, just like any normal native app. The car's native operating system maintains total structural control. It can smoothly overlay battery warnings, it can shrink the map, or move it to a different screen without breaking the video connection.
The car differentiated itself from the projection. It finally realized, I am the car, I am the host, and you are just a temporary app on my screen. That is incredible. The solution to software failure is the exact same solution to psychological enmeshment: boundaries. And there's another database example in the sources that illustrates this perfectly, right? Something called the anti-projection trap.
Yes, this occurs in enterprise event-source databases, like the Chronicle AutoMap system. In these architectures, developers frequently project data from an event stream onto a read model so users can search it. The system looks for matching properties to build a connection.
Okay, makes sense.
But here's the flaw. If a child class is entirely missing a mapping attribute, meaning the data connection fundamentally does not exist, the system is programmed to fail silently. It doesn't throw a red error, it doesn't crash or warn the developer. It silently projects an empty collection.
It just hallucinates that the data structure is there, but it's totally vacant. It gives you a blank folder and pretends it did the work.
It hallucinates a relationship that doesn't exist, silently corrupting all the downstream data without triggering a single alarm. It is the exact, literal technical equivalent of human psychological projection. Assuming a profound connection is there, failing to actually find it in reality, and projecting a blank, vacant assumption in its place to avoid dealing with the error of the void.
So from the bruised human mind, to a screaming argument in a kitchen, to the false safety of corporate budgets, to the frozen dashboard in a car, to a silent error in a massive database, the failure is structurally identical. And the sources point out that this even distorts how we physically map the Earth we stand on.
Cartography is perhaps the most ancient and literal manifestation of the geographic projection trap. The fundamental mathematical problem of cartography is that you cannot translate a 3D spherical globe onto a 2D flat map without introducing severe mathematical distortion. Every single map projection you have ever looked at lies to you in a very specific, calculated way.
Right, like the famous Mercator projection, the one we all had on our classroom walls, which makes Greenland look like it's the size of the entire continent of Africa.
Exactly. The Mercator projection preserves local direction perfectly, making it an absolute masterpiece for maritime sailing. A straight line on the map is a straight line on the ocean. But the cost of that truth is a massive lie. It massively distorts area at the poles, it shrinks the equator, and inflates the north.
Wow.
If you want the truth about area, you use the Albers equal area projection. It preserves exact geographic size, but the cost is that it severely distorts direction and shape. You cannot have the whole truth. You have to consciously choose your distortion.
You have to choose which lie you are willing to live with. But cartographers don't just deal with mathematical lies. They also intentionally put human lies into their maps, don't they? Tell me about trap streets.
Trap streets are a fascinating quirk of the industry. They are fictitious entries deliberately designed to catch plagiarists. A cartographer will spend thousands of tedious hours surveying and mapping a city. To protect their intellectual property, they will draw a fake street, a road that bends the wrong way, or even insert a completely fictional town, like the famous case of Agloe, New York.
So if a lazy competitor copies their map and publishes it, the original cartographer can point to the fake town in court and say, "Gotcha, I made that up, so you stole this." The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife. We intentionally put deliberate lies into our objective maps to protect our ownership of the truth. We project our human fear of theft directly into the physical geography of the world.
And that leads to a profound ethical distortion, which is discussed in the final sections of our sources. The cognitive error of projecting a permanent, static state of capability onto dynamic, fluctuating systems. We do this heavily with recovering medical patients, and we do it with advanced AI. It's an ethics issue regarding variable autonomy.
I want to make sure I understand this. Variable autonomy. Are you saying we project a single state onto something that is constantly changing?
Yes. When a dynamic system, let's take a human patient recovering from a severe stroke, has a really good lucid day, observers and family members immediately project that peak performance across their entire future timeline. We assume they have total agency forever now. We withdraw support, expecting them to function normally.
But recovery isn't linear.
Yes, exactly. Conversely, if they have a bad day, if they're confused or fatigued, we project total, permanent helplessness onto them. We flatten their highly dynamic, fluctuating reality into a simple binary state, either fully capable or completely broken. This projection strips them of their fundamental rights when they are capable and cruelly abandons them when they are vulnerable.
We refuse to let them be complicated. We just project a static, flat image onto them because dealing with a fluctuating, complex reality requires too much cognitive empathy from us. This has been an absolutely staggering journey. From marriages violently falling apart over unhealed childhood wounds, to corporate budgets hallucinating billions in safety, to AI chatbots echoing our darkest depression, to Apple CarPlay hijacking a car's brain, and fake towns drawn on paper maps, it is all the exact same structural error. The observer mistakes its own internal conditioned state for objective reality. It thinks the movie in its head is the actual world. So we arrive at the ultimate question. If we are this thoroughly trapped, how do we break the mirror? How do we escape the projection trap?
The interventions span across all these different disciplines, but they share a unified foundational architecture. First, in our personal, psychological, and professional lives, we must make a conscious transition from projection-based planning to perception-based responding.
Meaning we have to stop trying to rigidly control the future based on the traumas of our past.
Exactly. And the most practical tool for this is the pause. In a moment of crisis, or right in the middle of a heated argument with your partner, you must actively, forcibly stop the momentum and ask yourself a terrifying question. Am I responding to the actual reality in front of me, or am I reacting to my own mental movie?
That takes a lot of self-awareness.
And to answer that, you use the somatic trigger we discussed in Act 1. Check your body. If your chest is tight, if your jaw is clenched, if you feel a frantic compulsion to control the outcome, you are likely projecting. You must wait. You must regulate your nervous system until you feel that spaciousness in your breathing to ensure you are actually engaging with reality before you speak.
You literally have to wait for your body to give you permission to argue. And how does this transition look in the corporate boardroom?
In business, we must completely abandon the delusion of static annual projections. The sources advocate moving entirely to dynamic rolling forecasts. This is a continuous 12-month cadence based on real-time drivers, constantly adjusting to leading indicators, not historical wishes. You allow the financial model to change as the market changes, just as a healthy, mature ego adapts to new information rather than aggressively defending old wounds.
And in the realm of technology,
We enforce structural boundaries. Encapsulation. Just like the task view container saved Android Automotive, we have to build software systems where foreign inputs, user prompts, and AI hallucinations are strictly contained, allowing the core system to maintain its sovereignty and safety. And ethically, we must embrace dynamic autonomy, actively rejecting our lazy, binary classifications of human capability.
But clinically, when we get right down to the human heart of it all, the ultimate antidote is empathy, isn't it?
It is. Empathy is the direct, structural opposite of projection. Think about the mechanics. Projection is aggressively overlaying your reality onto someone else, fortifying the boundary between you, erasing their humanity.
And empathy.
Empathy is the deliberate, courageous weakening of your own boundary to actually step into and experience another person's reality. It requires what psychologists call cognitive empathy reconstruction, actively recalling a time when you felt as vulnerable, as tired, or as confused as the person standing in front of you.
You have to remember what it feels like to be on the other side of the mirror. You have to remember that they're as scared as you are.
Which brings us to a final, entirely new thought to leave you with. We spent this time talking about how we project our wounds onto our lovers, our spreadsheets, and our code. But think about our grandest pursuit as a species, the search for extraterrestrial life. We point massive radio telescopes into the dark void of the cosmos, listening for a signal. But look at our science fiction. Look at our theories. We constantly imagine aliens as hostile invaders coming to steal our resources, or as benevolent saviors coming to rescue us from our own environmental destruction.
Wait, are you saying we are projecting our own planetary guilt and our own history of violent colonization onto the universe?
It's highly likely. The next time you feel a surge of absolute, unshakable certainty about someone else's secret motives, or the absolute trajectory of your company, or the flawless layout of a map, or even the intentions of life in the stars, stop. What if the universe isn't giving you a window into the absolute truth? What if the universe is just handing you a mirror reflecting the exact shape of your own unhealed wounds, your own fears, asking you finally to look at yourself?
That is something that will stick with me for a very long time. Are we looking for aliens? Or are we just terrified of our own reflection in the dark? The monster isn't in the room, the light is just coming from behind our own eyes. Thank you for taking this custom-tailored deep dive with us today. Remember to question your certainties, check your somatic triggers, and always try to look past the reflection. We'll see you next time.